So what I thought was quite interesting was maybe the difference between the tone that Chair Powell struck in the press conference and the tone of the summary of economic projections. I think Chair Powell obviously acknowledged the great amount of uncertainty that the FOMC is facing. And obviously we didn't see a shift in the median dots, but you did see a shift towards tighter policy in the distribution of the dots. You know, you saw 8 dots, projecting rates of kind of just one cut this year or no cuts. Yeah. So I do think that was quite a shift relative to December. And I think the other thing that was interesting was when discussing kind of the inflation impacts, Chair Powell, pointed a lot to some of the dynamics we've seen recently potentially being driven by tariffs and the idea that, some of the forecasts could be driven by tariff risks. Whereas on the growth side, he kind of, despite the downward revisions in terms of the projections for growth, he did say that, you'd seen softness at the minute in the soft data, but that hadn't necessarily translated into the hard. And so I just think there was a little bit of a contrast between what we could take away from the summary of economic projections and the actual signalling from Powell in the press conference.
Because Karen and I speak a lot about the sentiment data versus the hard data, and that was a clear delineation. He's saying, look, the hard data is fine at the moment.
Yeah, I think we're expecting a step down in consumption in the first quarter, and I do think that's partly related to this pattern that we tend to see in the US economy, where you see a very strong Q4 followed by a relatively soft Q1. But I do think that if we look at the retail sales report that we got earlier this week, it was relatively mixed. You saw a bounce back in the kind of control group of stores, which is the stores that feed into the estimates of the national accounts for spending. And when we look at that, you've seen a bounce back, but that's from a very soft January. So you're kind of back where you were in December rather than seeing necessarily a re-acceleration. So I do think the question will be, if we see some of that sentiment data ultimately kind of feeding into both consumption and also investment. I think the other thing to acknowledge is just this idea that if we think about kind of expectations for the Fed this year, it feels like the distribution is potentially that they deliver less easing than more. And I think we have to think about how that potentially feeds into investment decisions for firms as well.
Let me tackle sentiment from another angle. And this was from the post that we saw from Trump, effectively egging the Fed on to cut interest rates, even as they face this tariff threat that could be inflationary for the economy. What sort of message and what sort of sentiment impact does that actually have? Because it was only a few months ago we were talking about how bond markets were concerned about the extent of government spending, government debt, and that if we saw any extra pressure on top of this for the Fed to get going, any lessening of the independence, then that would be just another negative on top. And the markets might just see some sort of tipping point. For Trump to get involved at this point and call on the Fed to be cutting rates, how political is that and how unhelpful at this stage?
Look, the chair is always very careful in his communications around the implications of these.
Trump wasn't, which was the point.
Yeah, I think for the FOMC, they're going to be looking at the administration's policies. They'll say, here's what the policies that have been announced, and here's how that's going to impact growth, and here's how it's going to impact inflation, and then that ultimately feeds into their monetary policy making. I think that's the way the FOMC will be viewing that. I think the question is, just given the uncertainty we've seen in the administration's policies so far on tariffs, I think that is making it a challenging difficult time for the FOMC in their monetary policy making, because part of the issue with the tariff policies is to actually truly understand the effect, you need to know how long they're going to be implemented for. And obviously, as we've seen so far, there's been kind of changes in tariff policies relatively quickly. And so that's a very difficult environment for the FOMC to kind of gauge the effect on the economy.